Chapter 5 Independence and Civil War, Part 1. The War of Independence was not just about home rule, but about who would rule at home. Historian Carl Becker. What sort of revolution was it? Radical or conservative? Military or social? Earnestly democratic or hypocritical farce? Perhaps a bit of them all. What it most certainly was not was what is presented in the comfortable, patriotic, grade school yarn to which we've all grown accustomed. Yet neither was it something out of a fable of white privilege that can be dismissed outright. Let us begin with the famous painting, The Surrender of Lord Cornwallis, commissioned by the U.S. Congress and displayed in the Capitol Rotunda. This rendering prompts some questions. Who, exactly, won the war, and what sort of war was it? What's not depicted, and why? The artist captures the moment of British surrender after the Battle of Yorktown in 1781. It's all so neat, so symmetrical, with regular Continental Army soldiers mounted and standing at right, and equally spiffy French troopers, replete with clean white uniforms, at left. The humbled redcoats stand beneath an American officer and offer their surrender as a mounted General George Washington observes from the rear at right. Were this the only portrait available for posterity, the viewer might assume the War of Independence was a rather conventional military affair, waged tidily between two gentlemanly armies. The popular image is something like this. The Continental Army, with some help from the French, vanquished the Brits and won a new independent nation. There was no dirt, no grime, nothing messy or complex. There were no women, no blacks, no Native Americans, certainly no loyalists or uncouth colonial militiamen involved. Perhaps this is how Americans like to remember the Revolution, how elementary school teachers transmit this epic past. As we've seen in previous chapters, the way we remember the past is as fascinating and instructive as the reality of events. This is particularly true of the American Revolution, which, I would suggest, is America's second origin myth, a saga of colonial liberty smiting British tyranny once and for all, a story topped only by the initial settlement of the colonies. Would that it were so simple. When evaluating the American Revolution, we must essentially parse out comprehensive answers to the following questions. How and why did rebels, whose army never won a battle in the open field, defeat the most powerful empire in the Western world? How was the social and military experience of revolution lived and experienced by a diverse colonial population? And finally, what did it mean to win, and who exactly were the war's winners and losers? In seeking to answer these questions, we may not always like what we find, or we may become confused by the cluttered conglomeration of the revolutionary experience. Still, perhaps we will also unearth something profound about who we were as Americans, who we strove to be, and how far we've come in achieving our great revolution. Blood has been shed, from Lexington to Bunker Hill. In Chapter 4, we left our anguished and hopelessly divided American colonists on the verge of rebellion, just 12 years after the defeat of France in the 7 Years' War. With the benefit of hindsight, revolution appears all but inevitable, yet nothing was predetermined. Some spark was needed to engulf the continent in bloodshed. It would come in Massachusetts. On the eve of war, the British, like so many regular imperial armies before them, believed they could intimidate the rebels with a display of impressive uniforms, lockstep marching, and a basic show of force. In and around Boston, the British sought to seize large stores of colonial arms and, in that strategic vein, marched out of the city towards the village of Concord in April 1775. They bet wrong. The overt show of military force actually raised tensions, radicalized the populace, and caused conflict. Besides, seizing centralized armories would not in itself work in America due to one characteristic of the colonists. They were armed. Consider for a moment the radical ramifications of an armed populace. The Americans were unique in that, unlike Englishmen, Scots, or Irishmen, nearly all white men were gun owners. The tools were there. It seemed war would come eventually. It was a matter of when and where. At about 4 a.m. on April 19, 1775, the British regulars on the road to Concord ran into a paltry colonial show of force. 70 or so militiamen had gathered, with muskets, on the Lexington town green. A British officer ordered them to disperse. They did not. No one knows who fired first, but it was the seasoned British regulars who fired last, at least for the moment. When the smoke cleared, several colonists, English subjects, lay dead. More were wounded, and the rest had fled. The road to Concord lay open, and the British took it. Then, on the way back to their base in Boston, something happened. Colonists from neighboring towns, using hit-and-run tactics on home turf they knew thoroughly, inflicted hundreds of casualties on the withdrawing British redcoats. It was a bloody day, and it changed the course of American history. After Lexington and Concord, both sides sought to use the day's events as propaganda to drum up support. Both told lies. Some colonists claimed that marauding redcoats had slaughtered women and children in their path. Some Britons told tales of rebel colonists scalping, and in some cases cannibalizing, surrendered prisoners. And so, as is often the case, matters after this first draw of blood took on a chaotic momentum. Many formerly lukewarm patriots from the other, less zealous colonies now stood with their firebrand cousins in rebellious Massachusetts. It was to be war, a war among and for the loyalty of the people, the sort of war that doesn't end well. The conflict centered in Boston for the next several months, and the once overconfident British learned their lesson again in the famous Battle of Bunker Hill, which was actually fought on Breed's Hill in June 1775. Observe the painting, The Death of General Warren at the Battle of Bunker Hill, from 1815, painted by John Trumbull. Like the Cornwallis painting, this is the work of John Trumbull, essentially the official artist of the Continental Army. In his romanticized depiction, which has become visual gospel of the patriot cause, the brutal Brits, accompanied by dark clouds, charge the hill and attempt to bayonet a dying General Joseph Warren. Warren, of course, is clad in virgin white and lies in the Christ-like lamentation pose so popular in paintings of the time. In the battle, the attacking British chose a frontal assault, rather than General Henry Clinton's preferred flanking maneuver, and eventually dislodged the colonists. In a sense, the British won. They held the field. But it was a Pyrrhic victory. More than 1,000 British and 400 Americans were killed or wounded. Though it occurred just 2 months after the fighting commenced, Bunker Hill would prove to be the bloodiest single-day encounter of the entire war. This before the colonies had even declared independence. Indeed, that was to come much later, some 13 months afterward, in July 1776. Just 1 month after the combatants soaked Breed's Hill with blood, the colonists sent the famous Olive Branch petition to King George III, seeking a negotiated solution to the conflict. Most colonists still viewed themselves as both American and British. Few expected outright detachment from the empire. Only the timing was poor. The king, having received word of the bloodshed in Boston, ignored the petition and instead declared the colonies in rebellion in August 1775. The king may, in fact, have passed up an opportunity to de-escalate the rebellion and divide the colonists. Instead, the patriots among them moved irrevocably towards independence. The decision for independence, the issue of God-given equality. All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Thomas Jefferson, 1776, and Vietnamese revolutionary Ho Chi Minh, 1945. It was in these fiery times, after Lexington conquered and Bunker Hill, that Thomas Paine penned Common Sense. This wildly popular tract, it sold 100,000 copies in a single year, estimated to be the equivalent of 12 million copies today, was concise and accessible, written in a plain language that spoke to a widely literate American population. In a sense, Paine was a strange messenger for 18th century colonists. A Briton who had recently arrived in America, Paine had, until January 1776, largely been a failure, and for the times he was a radical, an atheist who called for the abolition of slavery and an early form of universal health care. Paine had one more seemingly radical idea: American independency. Paine's Common Sense described the logic of division from Great Britain and dramatically extolled the virtue of the American cause. There is something exceedingly ridiculous in the composition of monarchy. So far as we approve of monarchy, that in America the law is king. But there is something very absurd in supposing a continent to be perpetually governed by an island. The cause of America is in this great measure the cause of all mankind. The sun never shined on a cause of greater worth. We have it in our power to begin the world over again. What it did, besides motivate the patriots, was logically bridge the gap to a declaration of full independence from the British Empire. Within months, the Continental Congress in Philadelphia would come to the same conclusion, and a young Virginian planter and slaveholder named Thomas Jefferson would be nominated to pen the proclamation. What sort of document was this? For one thing, the decision to write it was itself radical. This was, at root, an act of treason to which dozens of men courageously signed their names. It was a lengthy list of grievances against the king himself, an explanation for their decision to rebel. But it is the document's preamble that we remember, and this, of course, was a thorny matter. The preamble speaks of all men being created equal, and certainly the Founding Fathers did not mean to extend political rights to women. But which men? White ones, of course, perhaps with a little property, or, in the more progressive colonies, perhaps even the landless. Slaves or free black men, 1/5 of the population, didn't count, nor did the savage Native Americans beyond the Appalachian frontier. A simple and not altogether incorrect conclusion would be that the Declaration of Independence was, at root, a hypocritical document, but there is much more to it. The preamble and the main prose of the Declaration tells us many things. Here is one. This was a war about ideas more than territory, and ideological wars tend to be long and brutal in their prosecution. It is, as my experience in America's intractable 21st century Mid-East wars demonstrated, a very difficult thing indeed to defeat an enemy fighting fundamentally for ideas. As noted above, Ho Chi Minh, the Vietnamese revolutionary communist and sworn enemy of the United States, directly quoted the line from Jefferson's preamble in his own country's Declaration of Independence from the French Empire in 1945. Ho's embrace of Jefferson's language demonstrates that the meaning and interpretation of words and sentiments changed through the ages. A non-Christian Asian would certainly have found himself excluded from the fruits of America's 18th century revolution, and yet, perceiving a universalism in the document's preface, Ho was inspired by Jefferson's words nearly 2 centuries later. This, perhaps, is the American Revolution at its imperfect best. The Civil War of 1776. Loyalists and Patriots in Revolution. Upon the whole, if we allow at most 2/3 of the people to have been with us in the Revolution, is not the allowance ample? Divided we have ever been and ever must be. John Adams, 1813. Benjamin Franklin was, perhaps, along with George Washington, the most famed and avowed patriot of them all. For all that, Franklin's own family divided over the Revolution, and one of his most harshest critics was his own son, the royal governor of New Jersey and a staunch loyalist. If even the Franklin family could be torn asunder in the tide of revolution, then certainly something profound was afoot in the colonies. In addition to being a war for independence, the American Revolution was, and at the time often was referred to as, an American Civil War. This was a revolutionary war in the most basic sense, full of armies, guerrillas, militias, local strongmen, and counterinsurgents. While quite 18th century in its flavor and makeup, it was not unlike 21st century events in Iraq or Syria. Though rarely thought of in this way, as a proportion of the population, nearly as many Americans fought one another in the Revolution as in the Civil War of 1861 to 1865. To understand this, we must consider the extent and power of loyalism of one stripe or another. A bit of mental math is in order. We'll stick with the men. Let us assume that 50% of white men were patriots. The fifth of the population that was black mainly sided with the British. That takes our calculation of patriots down to only 40% of the male population, and of course that excludes the Native Americans, who were admittedly not considered in colonial censuses, who were also, as we'll find, generally allied with the British. In other words, whether in the lead-up to or in the midst of the Revolution, the male patriots probably did not constitute a majority. We often imagine the loyalists to the British cause to have been ultra-conservative aristocrats, but in reality they came from all social ranks, classes, and races, and had varied levels of devotion to the imperial cause. There were many reasons to remain loyal: devotion to king and crown, business connections with the imperial bureaucracy, caution, apathy, and sometimes frustration with the excesses of the patriot masses. We must remember that no more than half of the white colonists were outright patriots. Yet rebel crowds, or mobs depending on your point of view, from that fraction took it upon themselves not just to protest, but take up arms, to engage in acts of violence, and frankly, to enforce adherence to their own cause. This drew the ire of many a loyalist, or even neutral, observer. Consider a brilliant satire penned by New York loyalists in 1774, entitled "At a Meeting of the True Sons of Liberty." The authors mock the patriot penchant for dramatic proclamations and list 15 farcical resolutions. The 15th and final is instructive. Resolved, lastly, that every man, woman, or child who doth not agree with our sentiments, whether he, she, or they understand them or not, is an enemy to his country, wheresoever he was born, and that he ought at least to be tarred and feathered, if not hanged, drawn, and quartered, all statutes, laws, and ordinances whatsoever to the contrary notwithstanding. The Loyalists and the many fence-sitters, the latter group surely had sizable numbers, found the Patriots exhausting and intrusive. Some took up arms for the British cause, others disseminated Loyalist pamphlets, and many held their tongues until it was all over. Often, neutrality or conscientious loyalism was seen by the Patriots as unacceptable. With British regulars pinned down and concentrated by the mere existence of Washington's Continental Army, Patriot militias policed allegiance to the rebellion in unoccupied towns and villages. It is not that there weren't plenty of loyalists. It's that the British always overestimated the number prepared to throw in their lot militarily with the fleeting, ever-on-the-move British Army. By trying hard to raise such loyalist units, the British ended up fomenting a civil war, while lacking the troop numbers and mobility to back their colonial allies in the distant cities and hamlets. Even in the South, where it was believed, correctly to some extent, that loyalism ran strong, the British could only capture territory and then move on, leaving the task of securing it to local loyalists. Consider it an Americanization strategy on par with the U.S. Army's Vietnamization strategy in the Vietnam War, in which U.S. forces sought to hand off territory and responsibility to their local allies in South Vietnam. Once the British, or later the U.S. military in Vietnam, left an area, however, trouble arose in the rear. Rebel terrorism was often met by loyalist retaliation as a cycle of civil war gathered its own chaotic inertia. Brutal it was, and bloody it could be, but it might have been much worse. Part of the ultimate explanation for British defeat must lie with the general's decision, as gentlemen, not to unleash many of the most vicious and violent loyalist militias on the patriot populace in a sort of total war. The British, even late in the hostilities, continued to see the colonists as misguided countrymen and hoped at some point to reconcile, not shatter, American society. Still, in the South in particular, the addition of revolting slaves into the civil maelstrom ushered in the nastiest phase of the war. More Americans died in this communal aspect of the conflict than in conventional British-American battles. Indeed, in the Deep South, the Continental Army had serious recruiting troubles, as Southern patriots were more concerned with policing and protecting against rebellious slaves than with directly fighting for the gallant cause of American independence. What then are we to make of these other, forgotten Americans, the slaves, the Indians, the women? How did they perceive this revolution, or, more aptly, this Civil War? The next chapter will deal with these questions and ponder an issue at the center of the conflict. Exactly whose revolution was it? Chapter 6, Whose Revolution? Part 2. The history of our revolution will be one continued lie from one end to the other. John Adams, 1790. Just how radical was the American Revolution? Historians have debated that question for the better part of a century. A true consensus still escapes us. Nonetheless, the debate itself is instructive and tells us something of the nature of this experience. No doubt the American version of revolution lacks many of the standard symbols of radical revolution as we've come to perceive them, with neither the guillotines of France, 1789 to 1794, nor the gulags and purges of Russia, 1917 to 1923. Still, there was an 18th century radicalism all its own to the American experience. Pennsylvania was one hotbed of radical egalitarianism. As early as 1775, radicalism erupted in the Philadelphia militia. The radicals labeled themselves the Associators and proclaimed an agenda for armed social reform in the colony. 6 decades before Karl Marx began writing, they sought to curb the individual accumulation of excess wealth and called for universal white male voting, regardless of financial status, and a general opening up of economic and political opportunity to the masses. The power of the impassioned masses, or mob, continued throughout the war, especially in its early phases. After being read the Declaration of Independence, New York City patriots used a rope to pull down an equestrian statue of George III at Bowling Green. The crowd then demolished the statue, cutting off the head and mutilating the face. The scene calls forth memories of the toppling of Saddam Hussein's statue in Baghdad's Firdos Square in 2003. As a final radical act, the Patriots melted down the statue into 42,000 musket balls for the Continental Army to fire at the King's soldiers. It must be remembered that simultaneous with and subsequent to the drafting of the Articles of Confederation for the United States, each individual state tackled the serious business of crafting its own new constitution. Some were rather conservative documents, others quite radical and egalitarian. Indeed, in only 2 states, Virginia and Delaware, did the initial revolutionary constitutions maintain property requirements for voting, though many post-war constitutions later reinstituted property restrictions. In the excited frenzy of revolution, many elites lost control of the masses. This made many leaders, John Adams among them, uncomfortable. States such as Pennsylvania experienced what historian Gary Nash called a revolution within a revolution, instituting universal male suffrage, a powerful unicameral legislature, and early steps to abolish slavery. Thomas Paine's hand was again at work in this business, seeking to make Pennsylvania the most advanced democracy in the world. Vermont, too, had a radical trajectory, becoming the first state to ban slavery outright in 1777. New Jersey even extended voting rights, however temporarily, to women, something no other state would achieve until Wyoming did so nearly a century later in 1869. Furthermore, the civil aspect of this war, as we saw in the previous chapter, added to the radicalism of the Revolution. Though there were no guillotines in Philadelphia or Boston, there were, by war's end, more land cessions and flights by Loyalists, mostly to Canada, per capita than in the later French Revolution. Still, for all this evidence, and much more like it, there remains something ultimately unpersuasive about the highly radical revolution argument. It ignores the experience of non-white males. It must be remembered that while in a sense the revolution had quite radical components for those white men, even those without property, the experience and outcome of the war appeared far less radical and more conservative when seen through black or Indian eyes. That, ultimately, explains the geographic, focused on the northern colonies, racial and patriarchal, whites and males in the narrative foreground, limitations of historian Gordon Wood, made famous by a memorable scene in the film Good Will Hunting, and his esteemed book, The Radicalism of the American Revolution. The Forgotten Fifth, When Freedom Wore a Red Coat, The Slave Revolution. Your 4th of July is a sham, your boasted liberty an unholy license, your shouts of liberty and equality hollow mockery. Frederick Douglass, 1852. Examine the fragment of the painting The Death of Major Pearson by John Singleton Copley. In it, a proud, dashing black soldier, with a plume in his cap, fights on the British side against the French in a 1781 battle in Europe. In the American War of Independence, too, African and African American slaves often took up arms with the British against the colonists. Many were members of the 1st Ethiopian Regiment, raised in November 1775 by the Royal Governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, in a famed proclamation that bore his name. Stitched into the uniform of each member of the Ethiopian Regiment were 3 words: liberty to slaves. There is a scene in the terribly inaccurate 2000 movie, The Patriot, starring Mel Gibson, in which a black man and former slave joins the Continental Army and by the final battle wins the respect of even the most bigoted soldier in the Gibson character's unit. It's a touching moment, and, indeed, some 5,000 black men, slave and free, would fight on the Patriot's side. The film, along with many other popular depictions of the Revolutionary War, gives us the impression that however imperfect American society was, most black people fought on the colonists' side. Nothing could be further from the truth. In proportion to their numbers in the population, black men were more likely than whites to serve as combatants in the Revolution. Only by and large they fought against the side that had proclaimed all men were created equal. This is a dizzying, inconvenient fact for some. It complicates and potentially sullies the revolutionary effort. But it is a fact we must know to describe the totality, warts and all, of our revolution. Lord Dunmore raised 800 to 1,000 slave volunteers by offering freedom to those who would flee their masters and gather under his banner. Word of Dunmore's proclamation spread rapidly through the colonies, giving hope to slaves and striking fear in planters throughout the Americas. It convinced many fence-sitting slaveholders that there could now be no reconciliation with the Crown. As Edward Rutledge, a South Carolina signer of the Declaration of Independence, wrote, the Dunmore Proclamation effected an eternal separation between Great Britain and the colonies, more than any other expedient. Indeed, across the colonies, especially in the South, slaves escaped their plantations and sought refuge wherever and whenever the British Army passed by or occupied a sizable locale. One military historian, Gregory Irwin, penned an influential article on this phenomenon, aptly titled, When Freedom Wore a Red Coat. Think on that for a moment. Most runaways sought their liberty by joining the British cause, not that of the Patriots. What might that say about our revolution? Was it thus no more than a contradiction, counter-revolutionary, and a farce? Perhaps, but once again, matters are not clear-cut. At war's end, the British actually sailed away from America with many thousands of slaves. No doubt they left behind some who had helped the British cause, and they sold or returned others, but by and large, and to their great credit, most British generals refused the demands of local colonists to return all of their slaves. At least a few slaves who left with the British had belonged to George Washington. Ouch. And consider the further irony that white patriots had for 2 decades regularly used the terms enslavement and slavery to describe their treatment by Britain's Parliament and tax collectors. Among the blacks who had fought alongside the British, many earned a new life after the war. Some 1,500 families settled in Birchtown, Nova Scotia, in Canada. Disease and a harsh climate decimated the former slaves, but at least they were free. Some years later, in 1792, more than 1,000 set out for the west coast of Africa, where they founded a new city, the aptly named Freetown, now the capital of Sierra Leone. These stories are inspiring and give us valuable insight into the two sides of the revolutionary struggle. Still, we have to be careful not to overstate the benevolence of British actions towards the slaves. These were at root military, not humanitarian gestures, and we cannot ignore the opportunism and self-interest in Lord Dunmore's proclamation. It's important to note that Dunmore extended the promise of freedom only to those slaves who were owned by rebellious patriot masters. Loyalists could keep their human property, and indeed, many did bring their chattel slaves along into prolonged exile in Canada. Compared with Carolina, Canada was free, but it was by no means a slave utopia. Still, viewed broadly, the vast majority of slaves either favored, served with, or fought for the British rather than the Patriots during the war. And the enraged planter class never let them forget it. Though this is almost certainly lost to modern readers, the Revolution was also the greatest slave rebellion in American history. It terrified the owner class and tightened an increasingly brutal slave system. The tragic irony, as historian Ira Berlin has shown, is that the Great Slave Revolt of 1775 to 1783 spooked Southern planters into developing a more stringent, controlled, and vigorous antebellum slave system than that which existed before the Revolution. Millions of blacks would come to live under the lash of that slave society, the image we've grown accustomed to. The other America, the Revolution looking east from Indian country. Lay waste all the native settlements around, that the country may not be merely overrun but destroyed. Rush on with the war whoop and fixed bayonet. George Washington, Official Orders to General John Sullivan, 1779. In 2001, an excellent historian by the name of Daniel K. Richter penned a comprehensive native history of early America with the paradigm-shifting title, Facing East from Indian Country. Perhaps facing east is what a historian must do when considering Native Americans in American history, including the Revolution, to view Indian experiences face eastward rather than starting from the Atlantic coast and viewing the unfolding of history solely in a westward direction. How different the situation must have appeared to the Creek tribe southwest of the colonies, or the Iroquois to the northwest of New York. Just as the slaves realized that their interests were better served with the redcoats, the Native Americans recognized that their autonomy had a better chance of being preserved if they allied with the supposedly imperial tyrants and against those who ostensibly extolled the inalienable human right to liberty. Native life, liberty, and happiness could, they believed, be maintained only by standing in opposition to the purported patriots. And so it was that most Indians fruitlessly waged war while allied with one imperial power, the British, to stave off the encroachment of a new, more dangerous, colonial empire, what Thomas Jefferson once called an empire of liberty. The outcome was tragic. As we saw during the 7 Years' War, the list of Southern colonial patriots is also a who's who of land speculators in early America. Washington, Jefferson, Patrick Henry, they all were in on it at one time or another. Now, in the desperation of war, the speculation game changed again. Recruiting for the Continental Army, a miserable, long, thankless duty, became difficult as the war dragged on. Recruiting officers, as ever, needed some way to entice enlistees. It became necessary to promise volunteers land, often Indian land, beyond the mountains, a total of 10 million acres. Native land was thus promised to future settlers without the permission or even the knowledge of the tribes. On the long frontier stretching from Georgia to New England, war with the British intermingled with smaller wars against British-backed native tribes. This was often the most vicious fighting the Revolution would produce. Take the example of frontier warfare in northwestern New York State. One historian, Page Smith, called the American campaign in western New York the most ruthless application of scorched earth policy in U.S. history. Here, General Washington unleashed General John Sullivan with orders to destroy the great Iroquois Confederation, and shatter it he did. The Iroquois mostly sided with the British, though the Revolution kicked off an internal Iroquois civil war when one tribal branch, the Oneida, allied with the Continentals. It got ugly fast. Washington called the devastation of the Iroquois the main American military effort of 1779, and detached 1/3 of his army to accomplish the task. Villages were razed, 160,000 bushels of corn burned, and thousands of fruit trees destroyed. Sullivan reported back to Congress that, except one town situated near the Allegheny, there is not a single town left in the country of the 5 nations of Iroquois. An Onondaga chief later summed up the experience thusly: they, Sullivan's troops, put to death all the women and children, excepting some of the young women, whom they carried away for the use of their soldiers, and were afterwards put to death in a more shameful manner. Admittedly, of course, native atrocities along the settler frontier were also common. In the end, the war, and especially American victory in it, proved, as in the 7 Years' War, to be yet another tragedy for Indians east of the Mississippi River. American colonists, millions that they were always more dangerous than a few thousand redcoats and a few hundred imperial bureaucrats spread thinly along the frontier. The United States of America was an existential threat to the native way of life. None of the affected tribes were included in negotiations toward the Treaty of Paris, which ended the Revolutionary War. No one consulted the Indians before the British saw fit to sign away millions of acres of native land to the new United States. Most native tribes would never accept such claims to their lands, which, to them, were predicated on the white man's conception of international law, something that had little meaning to those living in Indian country. This situation set up what would become a decade of on-again, off-again war between the armies of the new American Republic and the allied tribes of the Ohio country in the years following the signing of the Treaty of Paris. The last barrier, the infamous British Proclamation Line of 1763, had been breached, and the settler tide would never recede. In just over 50 years, that incessant tide would reach the Pacific Ocean. Within a century, all overt native resistance was subdued, as tribes chose between genocidal extermination and a life on reservations. Who shall fight for liberty? The Continental Army at war. The insults and neglects which the army have met with beggars all description. They can endure it no longer. I am in rags. I despise my countrymen. I wish I could say I was not born in America. I once gloried in it, but am now ashamed. Lieutenant Colonel Ebenezer Huntington, Yale graduate and veteran of battles in Boston, Long Island, and Yorktown, July 1780. When you picture an American Revolutionary soldier, what do you see? A Minuteman, of course. A logo of the New England Patriots, perhaps. In reality, though the militia and Massachusetts Minutemen played an important role, especially early in the conflict, most of the major fighting was done by Continental Army regulars, long-term volunteers filling Washington's ranks. Who fought the war and how it affected them is a story unto itself. War changes society. As John Shai wrote, the incidence of military service reflects and affects social structure. That was never more true than during the Revolutionary Era. To understand the challenges and tribulations of waging an 8-year war through the combined efforts of 13 diverse colonies, we must understand a key but often overlooked fact. Contrary to the linear, triumphalist fairy tales, support for the war and enthusiasm for military service actually consistently declined in the years leading up to the victory at Yorktown in 1781. Of course, we must remember that even as late as 1780, few would have predicted that victory was likely at all, let alone so near. In this environment of protracted war, in truth it was Continental regulars who performed much of the fighting because militiamen, men of property and some substance, were tied to their farms, families, and villages. This is not to degrade the importance of the militia. They performed vital, short-duration local service at key points in the war. Furthermore, it was the militia that waged a micro-revolution at the village level, enforcing patriot conformity in the townships and waging a civil war among neighbors. Since the propertied militias were often unavailable or unwilling, it was to a considerable degree the dregs of society who filled the ranks of the Continental Army. These were the poor, the landless, the immigrants, mostly German and Irish, the former criminals, the wayward youths, those, to be frank, who were most expendable in respectable colonial society. It was the lowest among them who eventually won for the American side. In time since, it has always been thus. Even so, it was only a tiny fraction of the population that actually experienced extended military service, and these poor souls were paid, if at all, in a currency, continental dollars, that was soon nearly worthless. Due to rampant inflation and the doubtful prospects of an often failing war, between 1777 and 1781, the value of 100 continental dollars fell to less than $2 in gold specie. The poorest of men were fighting for nearly worthless slips of paper. The frustration and resentment were palpable. In May 1780, just 1 year before victory was at hand, Private Joseph Plum Martin, a seasoned veteran of the Connecticut line regiments, observed that the men were exasperated beyond endurance. They could not stand it any longer. Here was the army starved and naked, and their country sitting still and expecting the army to do notable things. In the winter of 1780 to 1781, matters spiraled out of control, and Washington had a veritable crisis on his hands. In January, the Pennsylvania line mutinied, shot some of the officers, and marched on Philadelphia to demand back pay from Congress. Washington and Congress folded and negotiated a settlement. Days later, the New Jersey line mutinied, and this time Washington sought to create an example. He ordered executions, though, in passive protest, all 6 members of the appointed firing squad purposely missed their targets. By this point, some 1 in 4 of Washington's soldiers were in revolt. The army held together, just barely, and would march south to Yorktown, Virginia, and climactic victory just months later. The American War is over, but this is far from being the case with the American Revolution. On the contrary, nothing but the first act of this great drama is closed. Dr. Benjamin Rush, 1786. Sometimes, in hindsight, we readers know too much, are too informed of the outcomes to appreciate the contingency and emotional drama of what unfolded. In this case, the messy experience of an 8-year revolution and war of independence shaped the new American Republic. Through this crucible did 13 colonies cohere, sometimes fragment, and ultimately unite. As the historian Carl Becker wrote, the War of Independence was about more than home rule. It was also about who would rule at home. John Shai has called the Revolution a political education for the masses, and indeed it was. The war itself was messy and brutal. The stats are instructive. 150,000 to 200,000 colonists performed some military service, about 10% of the population. 25,000 Americans perished in the war, about 8,000 in battle, 8,000 of disease, 8,000 on filthy British prison barges, or more than 2 million in today's terms. 100,000 citizens chose exile over residence in the new republic, 60,000 loyalists and 40,000 slaves, or some 8 million in contemporary measures. So how did it actually happen? The victory, the colonial victory, that is. How and why did a rabble of patriot colonials ultimately triumph over the British Empire? There are many reasons. The British faced 3,000 miles of ocean to compound their significant logistic and communicative challenges. Limited guerrilla warfare contributed to their anguish. General Washington, though he rarely won, managed to keep the Continental Army in the field and in existence. In a sense, the rebels won because they did not lose. By virtue of their survival, they prevailed. This is often the case in popular uprisings, and why it was, and still is, so difficult to pacify a rebellious population with military force. Still, Americans mustn't forget that there might be no United States without the French, and eventually the Spanish, entry into the war on the Patriot side. To a large extent, larger than most Americans are comfortable with, the U.S. owes its independence to France. Without the French army, and more vitally the French navy, transforming our revolution into a global war, the conflict couldn't have ended when and how it did, with the British army encircled by land and sea on the Virginia coast at Yorktown. Maybe the Americans could have won without the French, or maybe not, or perhaps it would have taken several more years and the war would have done even more damage to society. What is certain, as John Scheid tells us, is this: a protracted war, especially one so reliant on popular, more or less voluntary military service, is itself a kind of revolution. In fighting the war, the fighting men and their families experienced a revolution of their own. What then, in the final sense, can we make of the American Revolution? This much, at least, I'd submit. The founders were neither the infallible demagogues depicted by the contemporary political right, nor, for that matter, pure villains to be pilloried, as some on the left would have it. These were imperfect human beings, men mostly, striving toward independence and tenuously remaking a society. Taking into account women, slaves, and Indians, the Patriot founders probably excluded about 60 to 70% of the American population from their dreams of life, liberty, and happiness pursued. This does not, in itself, erase the beauties of the founders' aspirations, words, and actions. Rather, I take these salient facts as a warning against all forms of rigid originalism, legal or otherwise, as a warning against the notion that our revolution and forebears ought to remain frozen in their 18th century moment. Instead, the imperfection and ambitions of the founders might remind 21st century Americans to beware of the misuse of the past, and to always seek the gradual improvement of society and the achievement of a more perfect union. In that sense, this author agrees with Benjamin Rush that, as he said in 1786, the American Revolution is not over, that naught but a few acts of the great drama have closed. We today are waging revolution still.